My ex-husband kicked me out after the divorce, screaming, "You never achieved anything on your own." Everyone just watched me leave crying, but I pulled out my late dad's old bank card. The manager turned pale and whispered, "Ma'am, please sit down." Then he showed me the screen and I couldn't breathe. "Does he know you have this?" I was still standing in the driveway of the house I used to live in, barefoot, shaking, clutching a trash bag full of clothes, when Mark slammed the front door so hard the frame rattled. The sound echoed down our quiet street in Glen Burnie, Maryland, and for a second I couldn't tell if the trembling in my chest was anger or humiliation. Probably both. "You never achieved anything on your own," he had screamed just before the door hit its frame. "Everything you have came from me, even your last name." And that was it. 13 years of marriage dissolved into one sentence shouted over his shoulder, while he tossed my things onto the porch like I was a tenant who missed rent. I couldn't move. My legs felt hollow, like they were made of wet cardboard. The neighbors' blinds twitched. Someone paused their dog walk. I kept telling myself not to cry in public, not to give him that image of me on the security cameras he pretended not to know I knew about. I finally forced myself down the steps, the trash bag bumping against my knee. My car, well, his car, technically was gone. He'd taken it earlier that morning without warning. My phone plan was shut off an hour after the divorce papers were finalized. I didn't even have a debit card anymore. He canceled everything tied to our joint accounts. The only thing left in my wallet was the old card my father gave me before he died. I had never used it. I wasn't even sure it still worked. Dad had slipped it into my hand at the hospital, voice cracking, and said, "Only if you're ever truly in trouble." I thought he meant emotional trouble, maybe the kind grief brings. I never imagined he meant this, standing on a sidewalk with no money, no home, no identity Mark hadn't taken credit for. I walked 2 miles to the nearest branch of Chesapeake Federal Bank, my feet aching, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. The lobby was freezing and smelled like printer ink. A young teller glanced at the worn card in my hand, eyebrows rising slightly before directing me to the manager. The bank manager was a man in his 50s with soft gray hair and the kind of calm face people trust. When I handed him the card, he didn't slide it through the reader right away. He turned it over slowly, studying the numbers, his expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My father," I said, wiping my palms on my jeans. "A long time ago." He nodded once, then inserted the card. The screen loaded slower than I expected, each second stretching out like it was trying to warn me. Then the manager's lips parted slightly, and all the color drained from his face. He looked at me, really looked at me, and his voice dropped into a whisper. "Ma'am, please sit down." My stomach flipped. "Is something wrong?" He swallowed hard. "Number not wrong, but you need to see this." He turned the monitor toward me. My breath snagged in my throat. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was seeing. The numbers didn't make sense. No, they couldn't make sense. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears, my vision tunneling, the air around me tightening like a fist. Because whatever my father had left me, it wasn't a simple emergency fund. It was something else entirely, something impossible. And in that instant, with the manager staring at me like I'd just walked in carrying a nuclear code, I realized my father had kept a secret that would change everything. I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to speak, but the manager leaned closer and said something that made my blood run cold. The manager's words were still echoing. "Your father didn't want anyone accessing this until, well, until a situation like this," as I sat there trying to steady my breathing. But as he printed the verification papers and stepped away to make a phone call, the shock churned into something heavier. Something old. Because the truth was, this moment didn't start today. It started years before Mark ever slammed that door. My life had been shrinking for a long time. When I met Mark in 2010, I was 24 and working at a small animal clinic in Annapolis. My father had just gone into remission for the first time, and I was starting to believe the world might make room for good things. Mark was charming in a polished, confident way, expensive watch, expensive smile, the kind of man who held eye contact like he already knew he'd get what he wanted. He told me he admired how hard I worked. He said I was refreshing compared to the women he usually dated. I didn't realize until much later that refreshing meant easier to control. The first shift happened a year into our marriage. He convinced me to leave the clinic because we didn't need my small paycheck, and it would be better for our future if I focused on the home. I pushed back, but he framed it as love. Wouldn't it be nice not to stress about early mornings and late nights? Wouldn't it be better to rest? I didn't understand that rest and isolation can look very similar. Dad noticed. During one of our Sunday visits, he pulled me aside while Mark was in the backyard on his phone, always on his phone, and said, "I don't like the way he talks about your job." I brushed it off. I didn't want to see what he was seeing. When Dad got sick again, this time for real, Mark became strangely helpful. He handled calls with hospice, managed hospital paperwork, and insisted he should be the one to deal with the financial logistics so I could just be a daughter. I was exhausted and grieving. I let him. 3 days before Dad died, he asked me to come to his bedside alone. The machines hummed softly, his skin gray and thin. He pressed that old bank card into my palm. His voice was barely a whisper. "If you ever feel trapped, use it. And don't tell anyone, not even your husband." I remember frowning, confused and hurt. "Dad, why would I be trapped?" He gave me a look I didn't understand at the time. A look full of things he wanted to say but didn't have strength left for. When he passed, the grief hollowed me out. Mark stepped into that hollow place and made it his. He handled the estate. He spoke to the lawyer. He decided which things of Dad's were worth keeping. I told myself he was just trying to take care of me. But piece by piece, year by year, he arranged my life so that none of it belonged to me, not the bank accounts, not the house, not even the car registered in his name. By the time the divorce papers dropped on our kitchen table 14 years later, I had nothing left but that card and a memory of my father's warning. And now here I was, watching the manager return with that same grave expression Dad had worn in the hospital. It struck me suddenly, my father knew. Somehow he saw exactly where I would end up. The manager sat down across from me, folded his hands, and said quietly, "Your father left you more than you think, and someone has been trying to access this account for years." My stomach dropped. Someone tried to access it. There was only one person who could have done that. The manager's words, "Someone has been trying to access this account for years," settled into my chest like a cold weight. But before I could ask anything else, he slid a form toward me and said he needed a few minutes to pull archived notes on the account. Then he disappeared into the back offices, leaving me alone in that sterile glass-walled room with the single most destabilizing truth of my life glowing on the monitor. The balance. The number so large my brain couldn't wrap around it. It wasn't wealth. It was generational, structural, life-rearranging power. My father, my quiet, blue-collar father who spent 40 years repairing HVAC systems, had somehow left me more money than Mark's entire extended family could make in 5 lifetimes. And suddenly every memory I had of my father's long nights, his out-of-state training trips, the envelopes he sometimes told me not to worry about, they were all vibrating with meaning I hadn't understood. But the shock couldn't hold off reality. Reality was that I had nowhere to sleep tonight. I could feel panic trying to claw its way up my throat, but underneath it was something harder, something unfamiliar, a kind of internal ignition. Because for the first time in years, Mark had no control over what happened next. The thought didn't comfort me, not yet, but it was the first breath of air I'd felt in a long time. I stood, pacing the small room. My reflection in the glass looked foreign, my hair messy from being shoved out the door, my face flushed. My eyes tired, hollowed, but awake in a way that scared me. 13 years of being minimized and managed had built a cage I didn't notice until today. But now that cage was cracked open. I kept replaying the morning in my mind. Mark's voice rising without warning, the final insult, the way he looked at me like I was weight he'd finally decided to cut loose. But the part that stuck, the part that gnawed at me, was how prepared he'd been. The shut-off phone plan, the canceled cards, the missing car, like he'd been waiting for the moment I had nowhere left to turn. Except he hadn't known about the card. He hadn't known Dad didn't trust him. And if someone had tried to access that account, Mark had known something was there. Maybe not how much, but enough to go digging. The manager returned with a folder and a new tension in his shoulders. He sat, opened the file, and spoke carefully. The account was set up with unusual privacy protections. Your father insisted on a manual alert anytime someone attempted to request information tied to your name. I forced myself to sit back down. "And who tried?" He hesitated. "Legally, I can't. I leaned forward, voice cracking. Please, my husband just threw me out. I have nothing. I need to know what's happening. He held my eyes for a long moment, then turned the folder so I could see. A printout, a date, a name, Mark S. Dalton, last year, while I was still in the house, while I was still trusting him. My stomach twisted. Of course he'd tried to see what Dad left me. And when they denied him access, when he realized he couldn't control it, he tightened the reins everywhere else until I depended on him for everything. That was the moment something shifted permanently inside me. Not rage, not grief. Something colder, more deliberate. A clarity that felt almost like stepping onto solid ground after years of sinking. I wasn't going back to that house. I wasn't going to beg him for anything. And I wasn't done uncovering what my father had been protecting me from. The manager slid a temporary card across the desk and said, "You have full access now. But you may want to sit down with our senior advisor. There are things about your father's account you'll need to understand." Things, plural. I tucked the card into my pocket with shaking hands. I didn't know where I was sleeping tonight, but I knew something else with absolute certainty. Whatever my father left me wasn't just money. It was leverage. And Mark had no idea what was coming. The senior advisor's office was on the top floor, behind a frosted glass door with a lock that clicked open only after the manager typed in a code. I didn't understand why we needed this much security just to discuss an inheritance, but the tension in the air told me this wasn't standard protocol. The advisor, her name was Evelyn Carr, stood when I walked in. She was in her early 60s, composed in a way that made me feel like she knew things before you said them. She didn't smile. She acknowledged me the way surgeons acknowledge patients right before delivering a prognosis. "Please," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. "Close the door." The manager left us alone. Evelyn folded her hands. "Before we discuss your father's account, I need to verify a detail. Did he ever speak to you about a project he worked on in the early 2000s? I frowned. "My father fixed air conditioners. He didn't have projects." Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture did, like I had just confirmed something she suspected. "Your father," she said slowly, "did not make his income from HVAC work. That was his cover." I could only stare. "His cover," she turned her monitor so I could see. Lines of documents, scanned agreements, non-disclosure forms, all signed by my father. Government letterheads, dates spanning nearly a decade. I felt my mouth go dry. "I don't understand." And then she said the sentence that cracked open everything I thought I knew about the man who raised me. "Your father was a silent partner in a defense research firm contracted by the federal government. He owned 22% of it." I shook my head. "No, that doesn't make sense. He lived in a tiny house. He drove an old truck." "He lived below his means deliberately," she said, "because the work he funded was sensitive. And because he didn't want his wealth exposed to anyone who might exploit you after he passed." Exploit. The word hit with surgical precision. I felt the room tilt. I gripped the arm of the chair. "Are you telling me my dad was some kind of secret millionaire?" She inhaled quietly. "Your father was worth over $60 million before he died, much of it tied to ongoing royalties from technology still in use by U.S. military contractors." I sat there, numb, but beneath the numbness, something sharper began to form: recognition. Dad's long trips. The nights he came home exhausted but never explained why. The way he told me to be careful about who I trusted. How he had pulled me close in that hospital bed and pressed that card into my hand like a lifeline. "I didn't know," I whispered. "He didn't want you to," she said. "Not until you needed it, and given what your husband attempted, he was right to hide it." I felt heat crawling up my neck. Mark tried to access it. He must have known something was there. Evelyn's eyes tightened just slightly. "He didn't just try, he made 3 attempts, increasingly aggressive ones. He even posed as your legal proxy." My stomach dropped. "He what?" She tapped a document. The signature was forged, but it was Mark's handwriting. "I recognized the slope of the M. He claimed you were mentally unfit to manage finances," she said. "That he needed temporary authority over your accounts." The air left my lungs. He'd been planning this, not just the divorce, the financial erasure, the control. All of it, but then Evelyn leaned back and delivered the twist that sent a cold ripple through me. "We flagged those attempts, yes, but last month someone else tried accessing the account." I froze. "Someone else?" She nodded. "Not your husband. someone using credentials that typically belong to federal contractors. My pulse hammered. Why would someone like that care about my father's account? Evelyn lowered her voice. Because your father didn't just leave you money. He left you controlling interest in the firm that owns the technology, and someone out there wants it back. The floor beneath me felt like it shifted. The betrayal I thought I understood was suddenly part of something bigger, something dangerous. And for the first time, I realized Mark wasn't the only person I needed revenge on. He might not even be the worst one. I walked out of Evelyn's office with a folder heavy enough to feel like a weapon. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. Inside were documents that confirmed everything she'd said. My father's ownership stake, the royalty streams, the forged requests Mark had submitted, even internal flags showing attempts from an unidentified federal contractor login. I'd come into the bank broken and humiliated. I was leaving with the kind of leverage that could destroy people. But revenge needs clarity, not chaos. And I was vibrating with both. I took a rideshare to a budget hotel off Ritchie Highway, the first place I could book without raising suspicion. The room smelled like bleach and old carpet glue, but it had a lock that only I controlled. I sat on the bed, the folder open in front of me, and tried to breathe through the swirl of fear, anger, and something I hadn't let myself feel in years: agency. For the first few hours, I read every line, every contract, every financial schedule my father had signed. The firm, Vanguard Systems Research, still existed, still operated under a shell company, and still generated an obscene amount of money through defense licensing fees. And somehow, through a chain of silent agreements and old NDAs, it now belonged, legally, to me. My father had been protecting me from something much larger than Mark's manipulation. He'd been protecting his work from people who wanted to control it, people who were still trying. By midnight, the panic had settled into something sharper. A plan. A real one. Not reactive, not emotional, strategic. Step 1. Secure the account. I met with Evelyn again the next morning to set up new multi-layer authentication. Physical keys, unique access terminals, the kind of security usually reserved for executives and people under federal scrutiny. She helped me transfer a modest portion of funds into a clean, separate account. Nothing that would trigger attention, but enough that I wasn't trapped again. Step 2. Document everything Mark had done. The forged proxy attempt was enough to open legal doors. If I filed a claim, he could face criminal charges for identity fraud and attempted financial exploitation. But charges alone weren't enough. I wanted him to feel what I felt: uncertainty, instability, the ground shifting under him without warning. Step 3. Build an independent paper trail. I scheduled meetings with a private attorney, one who specialized in marital asset concealment and financial abuse. When I slid the printouts across her desk, she let out a low exhale. Your husband is in more trouble than he realizes. Good. Step 4. Reclaim space. Real space. I found a short-term rental in Pasadena, Maryland, small, quiet, and private. When I unlocked the door for the first time, I realized I hadn't lived alone since my early 20s. The silence felt both terrifying and clean, like wiping soot off a window and seeing daylight again. But late at night, when everything quieted, a question kept circling back. Who else had tried to access the account? Why now? And how much did they know? That uncertainty pressed on me harder than Mark's betrayal. Because Mark's motives were simple: greed, control, the bruised ego of a man who believed I was nothing without him. But this other presence, the contractor login flagged by the bank system, felt like a shadow stretching behind everything. Still, I forced myself to stay focused. Revenge wasn't just about hurting Mark. It was about dismantling the architecture he'd built around me, financially, emotionally, psychologically. And piece by piece, I was doing exactly that. But I knew I couldn't confront him yet. Not until I had something that would make him feel cornered in a way he couldn't recover from. So I spent the next few days gathering receipts, emails he'd withheld from me, texts from his family explaining how long he'd been planning the separation, even a voicemail from his mother saying, "I know Mark said you'll land on your feet, but you should have been more grateful." Grateful. For what? Being suffocated. Everything was lining up. The structure of his lies, the motive, the proof. I was ready. But then, 3 days after I moved into the rental, something happened that blew a hole straight through the center of my plan. something that made every assumption I had about my husband, my father, and the past 12 years completely collapse. It happened on a Wednesday night. Just after 11 p.m., I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my rental, documents spread out across the surface, trying to map out the perfect sequence to force Mark into legal and financial freefall. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on Mountain Road. Then my phone, my new phone, tied to no one, buzzed. The caller ID was unknown. Normally I would have ignored it, but something in my gut told me to pick up. I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, a long one. Then a voice I hadn't heard in months, low and strained, came through the line. "Is this Anna?" My breath caught. "Who is this?" Another pause, then, "This is Tyler, I'm your father's former attorney." I sat up straight. "My father's attorney died 2 years before he did." "No," he said quietly. "That's what he told everyone, but he needed distance. There were people watching him, watching your father. I can't talk long, so listen carefully." The hairs on my arms rose. He continued, voice trembling just enough to make me believe he wasn't lying. "You think your husband is your biggest problem right now. He isn't. The people trying to access that account, they were never after the money." My pulse kicked hard. "Then what were they after?" "The patents," he said. "Your father didn't just invest in Vanguard Systems research. He created the foundational algorithm for their targeting software. The company has been trying to reacquire full control of it for years. But as long as your father's share exists, so does your veto power." My breath tightened. "Veto power over what?" "Product expansion, contract renewals, technology licensing. They can't move forward without the signature of whoever holds his stake." I gripped the edge of the table. "But why come after me?" He exhaled shakily. "Because your father refused to sign off on a new line of contracts 5 years ago. The kind that would have tripled the company's value but crossed a boundary he wouldn't tolerate. When he got sick, they assumed they'd be able to pressure whoever inherited his stake." My stomach twisted. "But my father left no trace of any of this with me." "He knew it wouldn't be safe," the man said. "There were attempts, quiet ones, to intimidate him. He pretended he was financially simple because it made him uninteresting. You were his weak point, and they knew it." The room felt like it was shrinking around me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. His tone shifted, faster, urgent. "Because someone just contacted me asking for confirmation of your location. Someone claiming to represent your husband." A cold jolt shot through me. My husband. Why would Mark? He wasn't asking out of concern, the attorney cut in. And he wasn't alone. A woman was with him. She did most of the talking. My mouth went dry. "What woman?" "I don't know her name," he said. "But she knew about the account. She knew about the patents. And she told me, explicitly, that you'd already given your consent to release certain documents, which you haven't." My heart pounded. A woman, working with Mark. Someone who knew about my father's legacy. I managed. "What did she look like?" "Tall," he whispered. "Dark hair, maybe late 30s, confident, very sure of herself." A chill ran through me. There was only one person that could be. Marissa, Mark's boss. The woman he insisted for years was just a colleague. The same woman who once told me, lightly, almost mockingly, "You're lucky Mark handles things for you. Money management isn't for everyone." The pieces slammed together hard enough to make me dizzy. Mark hadn't planned the divorce alone. He didn't just want to erase me, he wanted access to my father's stake. And he'd teamed up with a woman who had the connections to make it happen. Tyler's voice broke through my thoughts. "They're desperate. That makes them reckless. And you need to be very, very careful." I opened my mouth to respond, but the call suddenly went silent. Cut, disconnected, not dropped. Cut, and then, as if the night wanted to underscore the new reality I was living in, someone knocked on my door. Slow, deliberate, 3 times, not the front desk, not housekeeping, someone who knew I was here. My breath caught as the knock came again, louder this time. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it started, but the silence that followed was worse. I stayed frozen beside the table, barely breathing, listening for movement. Nothing, no footsteps. No voices, just the low hum of the hallway light outside my door. It took me nearly a full minute to gather the courage to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty, but a plain white envelope lay on the floor. My hands trembled as I picked it up and carried it to the table. I tore it open, half expecting a threat. Instead, it was a printed photo. Grainy, black and white, clearly from a security camera. It was Mark, standing in a parking garage, talking to Marissa, her hand gripping his arm, his eyes not angry, not fearful, but deferential, like a man reporting to someone. Behind them stood another man, the same one Evelyn had shown me in an archived government contracting document. A Vanguard Systems liaison. Watching them both, my stomach twisted. Mark wasn't leading anything. He was following orders. And suddenly everything, the rushed divorce, the forged paperwork, the attempts to access the account, snapped into devastating clarity. My phone buzzed before I could process it. Another unknown number. A text this time. If you want answers, come alone, no police, no attorneys, 30 minutes, Pier 5, Baltimore. I should have ignored it. I didn't. Because I needed the truth before I executed the final blow. I needed their motives, the real ones. The ones that weren't about marriage at all. The drive into Baltimore felt surreal, like I was piloting someone else's life. The inner harbor lights reflected off the water, fractured and sharp. Pier 5 was quiet at this hour, a few boats swaying gently in the current. They were already there. Mark stood stiffly near the edge of the pier, hands in his pockets like a teenager caught doing something stupid. Marissa stood beside him, poised and cold, her hair pulled back tightly, her gaze fixed on me with surgical precision. I stopped 6 feet away. "Talk," I said. Mark opened his mouth, but Marissa cut him off. "No, I'll talk." She stepped forward. "You deserve to understand the position you were meant to inherit." I forced myself not to step back. Marissa continued, voice calm and clinical. "Your father was a brilliant man, too brilliant. He developed an algorithm with real-world impact, one that changed defense targeting capabilities forever. Vanguard wanted full ownership. He refused, her eyes hardened. He said some technologies shouldn't belong to governments. My father, quiet, private, ordinary to everyone but me, had stood in the way of an entire industry. And Marissa wasn't finished. When he started showing signs of illness, the board hoped you'd be more pliable. I felt heat rising in my chest. Pliable how? Willing to sign, she said. Willing to release what he withheld. But someone, her eyes flicked toward Mark, made it clear you had no independent assets or legal sophistication. You were an ideal entry point. My throat tightened painfully. You targeted me because you thought I was weak. No, Marissa said. We targeted you because Mark sold you to us as weak. Mark's face flushed. I didn't, Marissa, that's not. Shut up, she said without looking at him. Then she turned back to me and her voice shifted, low, precise, chilling. Mark approached us first, not the other way around. He said you were naive, emotionally dependent, and easy to isolate. He claimed he could get your signature with the right pressure. He believed you wouldn't even understand what you were signing. I stared at him, nausea rising like a tide. Marissa continued, unbothered by the devastation she was peeling open. He wanted money. We wanted control of the patents. It was mutually beneficial until your father's bank flagged his attempts. Then we needed a different approach. My voice cracked. So he divorced me, kicked me out, tried to make me desperate enough to sign anything. Mark finally spoke, his voice small but edged with panic. You don't understand, I was trying to help us. We were drowning financially. I thought if we could get access, we could start over. They told me it was harmless, that you wouldn't be affected. Marissa's laugh was soft, humorless. He actually believed that. Mark's eyes darted between us, realizing, too late, that he wasn't a partner in this. He was a pawn, disposable. I let the silence stretch before I asked the question I'd come for. Why me? Why go this far? Why not walk away when my father died? Marissa's answer landed like a blade. Because your father built something he didn't believe should exist. We disagree. And as long as you're alive, your veto stands in our way. Alive? That wasn't a threat. It was an admission. And it told me everything about what I needed to do next. I drove away from Pier 5 with my pulse pounding in the back of my throat, but beneath the fear and the shaking, something inside me had settled. I finally understood the truth. Mark wasn't the architect of my suffering. He was a man who sold me to people hungrier than him. Marissa wasn't just ambitious. She was willing to rewrite international boundaries if it meant getting her hands on the last piece of my father's legacy. And I was the only obstacle left. They wanted me cornered. They wanted me scared. They wanted me quiet. But they had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated the daughter of the man who outmaneuvered them for 20 years. The next morning, I executed the plan I'd been building in pieces, now welded into a single, devastating strike. Step 1, legal detonation. I met my attorney at 8 a.m. sharp. I slid everything across her desk. The forged proxy documents, evidence of unauthorized attempts from contractor credentials, the recording I secretly made of Marissa admitting they targeted me, and describing the patent scheme. My attorney's expression shifted slowly, from concern to disbelief to something like awe. "This isn't just fraud," she said. "This is federal-level misconduct, defense contract tampering, corporate espionage. Your husband is going to prison." Good, but I wasn't done. She helped me file emergency motions. One for identity fraud, another for protection of intellectual property under my inherited rights. By noon, a judge had issued injunctions preventing Vanguard Systems, or any of its partners, from accessing or modifying any technology tied to my father's patents. Their entire expansion, hundreds of millions of dollars, froze in place. Step 2, financial collapse. I met with Evelyn at the bank and shifted my controlling interest into a newly formed trust managed by an independent oversight attorney, untouchable by Mark, Marissa, or Vanguard. Then I contacted Vanguard's minority shareholders. I let them know what I knew. Nothing scares corporate predators like a whistleblower with verified documentation. By 3 p.m., Vanguard's board was in emergency session. Their share price, normally stable, dropped 9% in 1 hour. Investors demanded answers. Government liaisons started sniffing around. Every door Marissa thought she controlled slammed shut. And Mark, his access to her world vanished with it. Step 3, public exposure. I sent an encrypted packet to a journalist at the Baltimore Sun known for investigating corporate misconduct. Inside, timestamps of the unauthorized access, attempts evidence of the forged signature audio of Marissa's admission, legal filings proving Vanguard had violated federal contracting ethics. I didn't editorialize. I didn't ask for sympathy. I just handed over the truth. The story broke the next morning. Defense contractor under investigation for patent coercion scheme. Local woman's inheritance targeted in illegal bid. Executive resigns amid tampering allegations. Marissa's photo was everywhere, stiff smile, wide eyes, career in flames. Mark wasn't named yet, but he was identified as a cooperating spouse implicated in forgery and coercive tactics. He wasn't cooperating. He was drowning. By evening, he called me. I let it ring. He tried again. I turned off my phone. Step 4, psychological ruin. The next week unfolded like a slow implosion. Mark was fired first. Then the police served him with notice of criminal investigation. His family, who once looked down on me, stopped returning his calls. Marissa went silent, her entire network turning to ash beneath her. I didn't lift a finger. I just watched the truth do its work. 2 weeks later, I stood on the shoreline in Glen Burnie, the air cold against my face. I thought about my father, how he lived quietly while carrying the weight of work the world was never meant to misuse. He had tried to protect me. He'd prepared for the day he couldn't. I finally understood the last gift he gave me, not the money, not the patents, but the choice. I chose myself, I chose survival, I chose justice. And when I finally looked at my reflection in the dark water, I didn't see the woman Mark had discarded. I saw the woman he never thought I'd become. The last line my father ever said to me echoed in my head. "If you ever feel trapped, use it." I did, and I'm free.